Thank you, Jim, and the Press Club for hosting this event, and I'm glad to be back with you all again. Much like I did, I guess, 4 years ago, we had this event both in the primary and in the runoff. The difference was all the candidates at that time showed up. I'll start off with just asking, where's Eddie? Look, it's a great time to be governor of the great state of Louisiana for a lot of reasons that I'll get into in a minute. Partly because the LSU Tigers are ranked #1 in the country and won Saturday. I'm excited about that. The Saints are leading the division and they won yesterday, and Drew Brees came back and picked up right where he left off. And perhaps most importantly, the Popeye's chicken sandwich is coming back to stay. So it's a great time to be the governor of the great state of Louisiana. And so I'll take your questions here in just a little bit. But I did want to start off by saying not only where is Eddie, but what's his plan? Why does he run from the media every time you try to ask him about his vision for our state? What his plans are to move us forward? What are the specific things that he wants to do? It's partly because he really doesn't have comprehensive plans or knowledge about how state government works, for that matter. And then the other part of it is the plans that he has are really, really bad for our state. You know, for example, he wants to repeal the Medicaid expansion. He calls it a freeze, but we know that it's a de facto repeal. That's exactly what the Pelican Institute, a conservative think tank in New Orleans, calls it. That's what the Louisiana Budget Project calls it. And in fact, that was the experience in Arizona with a freeze, when hundreds of thousands of people lost their coverage and the state budget was thrown into disarray because of the additional general fund requirements that come from that. It's also why the governor of Ohio, John Kasich, a Republican, vetoed a bill that would have frozen Medicaid, kicked hundreds of thousands of people off coverage, and exploded his budget. So that's not what I stand for as governor. As you know, I signed the executive order to expand Medicaid. It has saved our state money. It has saved hospitals. Most importantly, it has saved lives. You know, he says he wants to call a constitutional convention. That certainly would threaten the homestead exemption, which people enjoy all across the state of Louisiana. And that would require local governments to actually raise taxes on homeowners. It would threaten supplemental pay for law enforcement officers, something that I have voted repeatedly to support and to increase as we're able to do that, and something that I remain committed to as well. And so I am committed to making sure we continue to move Louisiana forward in a way that I think we can all be proud of. And quite frankly, I don't take my cues from puppet masters.
All right.
And the corrupt Lane Grigsby. He doesn't get to tell me what to do. He certainly isn't my mentor, and I don't look to him sitting on any sort of throne to give me a directive as to how I'm supposed to govern the great state of Louisiana. So I am here before you today because I'm actually proud of where our state is, especially relative to where we were 4 years ago. You will remember the largest budget deficit ever in the history of our state. It exceeded $2 billion. That's what I walked into, despite the fact that my predecessor had inherited about $1.5 billion in surplus. But we're doing much, much better today precisely because we came together in a bipartisan way. Everything we did required support of the legislature, and on the big issues, a 2/3 vote from a legislature that had a Republican majority in both the House and in the Senate. And we were able to do it, unlike what you see in Washington that is gripped by hyper-partisanship and the dysfunction that has resulted from that. But we have moved forward. We now have run 3 consecutive surpluses. This most recent year, a $500 million surplus after a $600 million tax cut, because our economy is performing so much better. How much better? It's the largest in the history of our state, measured as it always is by GDP. Happens to be growing at the 10th fastest rate in the country, #1 in the Southeast. Personal income is at the highest levels in the history of our state, grew 4.9% in the second quarter. And We know that unemployment is the lowest in almost 12 years at 4.3%, more than 2 full percentage points lower than when I became governor. We also know, and by the way, fact check everything I just said. Go to the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, go to the U.S. Department of Labor, and fact check those things, because you would be excused if you were confused, because my opponents and his supporters lie so often about those things. We announced also just a few days ago that the number of jobs in New Orleans finally back to pre-Katrina levels, and the number of jobs here in the Baton Rouge region, the highest ever recorded right here in Baton Rouge. So our economy is moving forward. We're doing better. And as a result of that, we now have more stability, and we have the ability to make needed investments, especially given that over the 8 years before I became governor, under Bobby Jindal, the state of Louisiana cut support for higher education more than any other state in the nation, while raising tuition more than any other state in the nation. An absolute disastrous recipe. So we're doing better. The Medicaid expansion is a big reason why. It helped us address the budget deficit. It saved us more than $300 million in the first 2 years. Simply put, someone uninsured costs the state more than somebody who's eligible for Medicaid through the expansion. Because it's 40 cents on the dollar from the from the general fund for care for someone who's uninsured, and it's 10 cents on the dollar from a statutory dedication from someone who is entitled to and eligible for the Medicaid expansion. But we also know that we haven't lost a single hospital in the state of Louisiana. Unlike what has been the case across the South and all the other states who didn't expand Medicaid, where they have literally closed by the dozens. We have the lowest percentage of people uninsured in our state's history. It's 8%. It's less than half of the uninsured rate when I became governor. It is lower than the national average of 8.9%, by the way. And so we're making tremendous progress there. Most importantly, it's saving lives, because working poor people now have health insurance, and they have the opportunity to seek primary care and preventative care that they didn't have before. Diseases are diagnosed earlier. Treatment starts sooner. They are restored to health. They get to keep working to support themselves and their families. And in many cases, they get an opportunity to live. Also, because of the economy performing so well and the stability that we've had, and we are able to make necessary investments. This year, the first new investment in higher education in a decade, critically important. That's all of higher education, our community colleges, our technical colleges, the 4 universities, and our HBCUs. We also gave the first teacher pay raise in 10 years this year. And by the way, my commitment, we're going to get back at least to the Southern Regional average in pay over the next 2 to 3 years as we are able to do that. It's critically important, because having the best teachers that we can have in our classroom is still the most important ingredient to quality education, which we want for our kids. So make no mistake about it, the pay goes to the adults, but the investment is in our kids, which is exactly why we also increased the block grant funding portion of our funding formula for K through 12 education this year by $39 million, and invested in early childhood education, $20 million more this year than last year. And you all have heard me say this, so I'll repeat it again. My #1 priority for new investments in education next year and going forward in the second term will be in early childhood education. I think that's critically important to eliminating the achievement gaps that have plagued us for too long, and improving educational outcomes across the board. So I have no doubt our state is in a much better place today than we were 4 years ago, and I am optimistic that we're going to be even better off 4 years from now. And I'm excited about the opportunities we're going to have to continue to move our state forward. But obviously you can't do that if you go back to the failed policies that ran our state so deep into the ditch. And that is exactly what Mr. Rispone promises to do. And on those representations by Mr. Rispone, I would ask you to take him at his word. Most of the rest of what he says, you would be entirely within your rights to just disregard. But on those things, you should take him at his word. So I will be happy now to take your questions. Yes, sir.
There's been a concerted effort by the RGA, Eddie Rispone, President Trump, the state Republican Party to paint you as anti-Second Amendment.
Yeah.
Is there any concern that if people just keep hearing that message over and over again, that it's going to sink in and eventually people will start viewing you that way?
Well, first of all, I know from the way you asked the question that you know better. And in fact, the difference between, the question was about the Second Amendment and the attempts by the Republican Governors Association and others to lie about my record, which, as you all know, that I have always been a strong supporter of the Second Amendment. I don't know of a single policy disagreement between myself and the president on this issue, by the way. And that's despite some effort to try to figure out exactly where the president is. But I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, as you know. The only difference between me and the president is I've actually been a gun owner since I was 9 years old, and Santa Claus brought me a Ithaca 20-gauge Featherlight pump shotgun that I have been using ever since. It's still in my gun closet, and I am an avid hunter. And I spent time in the Army, as you know, training on weapon systems that it's my fervent prayer people never have to use. But the people of Louisiana know better, and we're certainly doing what we need to do to remind people of where I'm at on the Second Amendment. And so I don't really have a fear. It's something that they do in every race. It's boilerplate stuff. It doesn't matter whether it's a lie. They just say it. And by the way, that's consistent with what they're doing generally. Yes, sir.
The parishes with the highest ratios of Medicaid expansion are primarily the rural northern parishes, which you lost substantially. Mm-hmm. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's a partisan issue, and I think those voters have been going that direction for a while. But you're right, and it's lost on a lot of folks that Medicaid expansion. Right now, we have about 459,000, I think it is, around the state. And the rural parishes have smaller numbers, but a bigger percentage of people who are actually covered, which is why this is so terribly important for rural hospitals, because rural hospitals are distributing less unreimbursed care. Their bottom line is better. They get to keep their doors open. And by the way, when a hospital closes, it doesn't just close its doors to the Medicaid population or to the uninsured or to the poor, although those things would be terrible. It closes its doors to everybody. And so it's important that we maintain the Medicaid expansion, keep these hospitals open, because people don't move to communities without hospitals. Further, we know that the hospitals, especially in the rural areas, in many cases are the driver of the economy. They have the most employees and the biggest payrolls. And good luck trying to get a company to invest in a community that doesn't have a hospital. And so we're much better off than other states where they've had hospitals closing by the dozen. I think there's been 102 hospital closures recently. We are certainly trying to make sure that folks all across Louisiana, but particularly in rural areas, understand how important this is to their future, both their collective future, but also to them individually. And quite frankly, there's a lot of folks out there who know they're benefiting from the Medicaid expansion. They don't know exactly who did what to allow them to get it. But we're going to continue to work because I am the governor for the whole state. You have never heard me address myself only to Republicans, only to Democrats, only to rural folks, only to folks in the urban areas. I am the governor for the whole state, and that certainly includes rural Louisiana. And we're going to be making a renewed effort to make sure that we're more effectively communicating with them and that they know what's at risk. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yes, ma'am.
Can you talk a little bit, you're just getting to it, can you talk a little bit about turnout? There was a pretty big disparity between voters who tend to vote Republican last time versus who tend to vote Democrat. What are you doing about it? How important is it?
Well, I mean, obviously turnout's important. Anytime you have a goal to get at least 50% plus one of the voters, you have to make sure that your voters go out. The turnout was actually about what we expected it to be. And by the way, the polling firm that works for me showed me at 47% in the week of the election, which is what we got. Obviously, we are working extremely hard, as does every candidate in every election, to make sure that people who want to vote for me, who will vote for me, actually get out and vote. And so we're doing that. And ask if it's important. Yeah, it's obviously important. I'm sorry.
Can you tell us any details about the effort compared to last month?
Well, we now know more about who voted in the primary and who didn't relative to people who voted previously. So we have an enhanced ability to target different folks that we're able to do through phone calls and door knocks. And I mean, it's just typical things that happen in every election. The biggest thing we have going for us is the stark choice before the voters of Louisiana right now. Before we had 6 candidates on the ballot, 3 major candidates, well-funded. Now it's myself and Mr. Rispone, who is by far the more extreme of the 2 Republicans who were in the race. And so the choice is much clearer. That is inuring to our benefit, and I sense that because of my travels around the state since the election, and I have a pretty good idea of what's going on out there, and what how I believe voters are going to act in this next election, which obviously the voting starts this coming Saturday with early vote. Yes, sir.
Governor, how good are your chances of winning over those Ralph Abraham voters from the first time around?
Yeah.
We're at the runoff?
Well, we're going to win enough of them. I'm looking for 3%. Mr. Rispone's looking for 23% based on the results in the primary. And so we're going to win over enough of them because, quite frankly, many of his voters are people who would have voted for me, did vote for me 4 years ago, but for the fact that he was in the race, he was somebody that they knew, he was their congressman and so forth and so on. Mr. Rispone doesn't have that benefit. So we're going to win over enough of them, especially those people who are concerned about health care, because Eddie Rispone's position is so extreme, especially in the rural areas of Louisiana. And that's where Congressman Abraham did the best. And so, look, it's sort of a strange relationship. He is my congressman. I come from North Nashville Parish, and I am his governor. And we had a good working relationship before this election, and we're going to have a good one after. And I spoke with him the other day just to make sure he knew that it was my intention that we would continue to have a great working relationship. And I asked him to make sure that he called on me if at any time I could ever be of assistance to him or in his role as congressman. So I believe that's going to happen. Yes, ma'am.
Are you concerned at all about the aggressive campaigning Trump and Pence are doing right now?
Well, I don't get concerned about things I can't control. At the end of the day, the president is doing what his party expects him to do. And it's a partisan thing. When it was time for governing, he invited me to the White House 9 times. I went and visited with him and with his cabinet, with congressional leaders, and we talked about things very important like transportation infrastructure, like the opioid epidemic, like criminal justice reform. And that day will come around after I'm reelected, and we will be governing again, and I will have a good working relationship with him because I think that it's incredibly important to do that. You can't be the best governor for the state of Louisiana if you don't have a good working relationship with the president, regardless of the party of the governor or the party of the president. And that was my approach in my first year when President Obama was in office. That has been my approach in this 3 years since then with respect to President Trump. But I would just ask you to look at the things he's saying. They're demonstrably not true. But it's just what he does, and they're just general talking points that he uses regardless of the state he's visiting or the candidate that he's talking about. And the people of Louisiana, they know me, and they know where I stand on a variety of issues, and they know that Louisiana was deep in the ditch 4 years ago, and I suspect the president doesn't know that. Maybe he doesn't know that we have the biggest economy in the history of our state, and it's the 10th fastest growing. Maybe he doesn't know that unemployment is the lowest in almost 12 years and more than 2 full percentage points lower than it was, or that we have the greatest amount of personal income in the history of our state. Maybe he doesn't know that we have the lowest percentage of people uninsured in our state's history today, or that the FBI crime report came out for 2018, the first full year since criminal justice reform was implemented in 2017, that showed that crime in Louisiana, violent crime and murders, decreased by more than the national average. Maybe he doesn't know that for 30 years we had the nation's highest incarceration rate here that wasn't making us safer and was costing us more than we could afford. So he's doing what his party's asked him to do, what he's expected to do, and when I'm reelected, I'll do what Louisianans expect me to do, and that is to resume the working relationship that I've had with him. Yes, sir.
Governor, what challenges do you foresee in the next 4 years in terms of the House getting close to a supermajority and a much larger Republican presence in the Senate in the next 4 years?
So the question had to do with the different composition of the House in the Senate, with both of them becoming more Republican. You know, they've had a considerable majority the whole time I've been governor in both bodies. If there's one thing that I've demonstrated over my 4 years, it's my ability to work in a bipartisan fashion. Every single thing we've done in Louisiana has been done on a bipartisan basis. And the most essential things, the biggest things, required a 2/3 vote that we were able to get with a Republican majority voting in favor, both in the House and in the Senate over and over again. So my approach doesn't change. I'm a Louisianan first. I've always said that, put people over politics and make sure that we're putting Louisiana first. And so I will sit at the table with anybody, regardless of party, so long as they want to show up in good faith and work with me to move our state forward. And that's what I'll continue to do in the second term. And the good news is in the second term, we've already achieved the stability that we needed. And that's going to benefit us all the way through the second term as well. Now, there are some other things that we obviously have to do. We have some challenges that remain. But the good news is we can meet those challenges now from a position of strength, not the position of weakness where we were. So I don't think really anything changes from the first term to the second term. Certainly my approach will not, and I will continue to have a cabinet that looks like the state of Louisiana as it currently does, not just with respect to having African Americans and whites, but we also have North and South, urban and rural, and by the way, we have Republican and Democrat as well. And I think it served our state well, and that will be my approach in the second term also. Yes, ma'am, Melinda.
Governor, can you talk about how you see this runoff fitting into the broader conversation about redistricting, and if you see differences in the approach you would take perhaps to what Mr. Rispone might take, and kind of what this race means in that context?
Yeah. Well, I believe the question was about redistricting. As you all know, the next census will happen next year in 2020. And once the results are known, typically what happens is you have a special session to focus on redistricting, and that will happen. I just believe we need fair maps, and I'm hopeful that that's what a majority in the House and the Senate want, where voters actually get to decide who it is that is going to represent them rather than having their representatives decide who the voters are going to be. And so we need a map that's fair, that actually has regularly shaped districts to the maximum extent possible, that don't separate political subdivisions more often than is necessary. But I would hope that that's what the vast majority of people in the legislature, but also around the state of Louisiana want. So I don't know that there's a tremendous difference, and I know what my position is, and I've been asked this question a number of times. I don't have a clue where Mr. Rispone is, so when you ask me to kind of compare my position to his, that's one of the reasons why he probably ought to be here today, so he can answer questions, and I think the people of Louisiana deserve to hear his answers on questions like this, but they're not going to get it. And just like he's not here today, he probably runs from you whenever you approach him too, to ask him questions. Yes, sir, Manny.
Do you approve of the, I think what they call it, portfolio model of schools in Orleans Parish? And do you believe that that is a model for the rest of the state?
Well, I don't believe it's a model for the rest of the state, and you will know that at the time that Katrina hit, schools in New Orleans were performing particularly poorly, and then the damage from the hurricane was disproportionate to New Orleans, and so you had locals there to an extent that you don't see elsewhere in the state supporting what happened in New Orleans with respect to the emergence and the prevalence of charter schools. And I believe it continues to have the support of the vast majority of people there. And because of the history of it, I would tell you New Orleans is what we see there with respect to schools is not a model for the rest of the state. And I don't think you have another parish that would support moving to a model like that either. Yes, sir.
You said your approach wouldn't change in your second term. Does that include things that got shut down on a partisan basis, things like higher minimum wage?
Yeah, no, I'm going to fight for, the question was, he asked me a question earlier about would my approach change because of the, or I'm not sure you asked it, somebody asked the question, would my approach change with respect to the legislature based on its current composition? And then this follow-up question has to do with initiatives that I will still champion. No, I will still champion those initiatives because it isn't just me who wants a higher minimum wage. It's about 70% of the people of Louisiana. The minimum wage is $7.25. It's been $7.25 since 2009, and the Congress is out of the business. We need to do something on the minimum wage. We're one of just a handful of states that doesn't have its own minimum wage today, and so we need to do something on that. And we also need to address the gender gap in pay. This is something that I've been supporting since I got elected to the legislature. It's something I ran on 4 years ago, and along with the minimum wage increase bills, we've actually run bills every single year in the legislature with legislators who are like-minded on these two topics in order to address equal pay for women. It should offend everybody in the state of Louisiana that women make 66 cents on the dollar on average compared to the male counterparts when they have the same qualifications and they're doing the same job. That's just wrong. And for women of color, it's closer to 50 cents on the dollar. We ought to aspire to be better than that, to do better than that. So I'm not going to stop championing things like that. And I would hope that regardless of the political makeup, party makeup of the legislature, that they will just listen to the people of Louisiana who support an increase in the minimum wage and addressing the gender gap in pay by huge numbers, huge majorities.
What about tax reform?
Well, tax reform is something that I'm absolutely open to, but you'll remember that I embraced 15 or 16 separate proposals that came from the commission that was created in 2016 to study tax reform. And it was created by the legislature to study and make recommendations to the legislature. We had legislators sitting on the task force. And the idea was that the committee would meet, do its work, and report back in time for the legislature to take up those tax reform issues before the 27 months expired. But exactly 0 of them were enacted. I think we ought to do it because while we have relatively low taxation in Louisiana. We were the 3rd state to reach Tax Freedom Day this year. So if you combine state and local and federal taxes, we were the 3rd state in the nation this year to get to Tax Freedom Day, meaning that all the work that had been done previous to that pays your taxes. The rest you get to keep. And that's certainly due in part to the $600 million tax cut that we did in 2018. But our system is unnecessarily complex because the nominal rate in many cases is not the effective rate. The effective rate is much lower than the nominal rate. And so what we ought to do is we ought to trade some of the exemptions, deductions, and so forth for a lower rate. I think we would all benefit from that, and that's the direction I would like to take. And by the way, that's the direction that the task force wanted to take on many of their proposals. But at the end of the day, we're going to have a legislature that will work in order to do that. And it shouldn't be that difficult, because lowering rates in exchange for getting rid of deductions and exemptions, especially those that are enjoyed by almost nobody else in the country, those are very conservative ideas that are championed by people like the Tax Foundation and others. And so I'm certainly not giving up on tax reform, but the legislature wasn't able to do it when it was really important to do it, and when they had committed themselves to it. So I don't have any great confidence that now that we have a period of stability and economic growth, where we are once again funding our critical priorities, that the legislature is all of a sudden going to say, okay, now's the right time to do tax reform. Yes, sir.
Going back to minimum wage, your recent minimum wage increase was higher than the one before that, and this year, if minimum wage increase fails to pass, you plan on basically having to increase the request for what you want minimum wage to be year to year based on whether or not it passed?
No, I'm one of those people that think somewhere between $9 and $9.25, $9.50 is the right place in Louisiana. Even if it takes a couple of years to get there, that would make a big difference for people. What I say is a moderate but meaningful increase in the minimum wage. That's what I'm talking about. And by the way, in the states that have done what I'm proposing, they haven't seen a loss of jobs, even entry-level minimum wage jobs. That has not been their experience. We've got neighbors to the north in Arkansas now that have raised the minimum wage 3 times. And that has not been their experience. Yes, sir.
Are you going to endorse any of the Democratic candidates that are on this runoff?
You know, I don't intend to do that. It's not something that I have done with any frequency since I've been governor. It's just, first of all, I think endorsements are the most overrated thing that in politics. People don't really cotton to having folks try to tell them who they should vote for and why. And so it's just not something that I'm intending to do. Mr. Hightower.
It was a hot issue last year in the legislature, and do you have any plans to, in the next 4 years, to address the high rate of automobile insurance in Louisiana?
Okay, so you lost me. Auto insurance? I couldn't hear you. No, but somebody over here heard just, and I think you were asking about automobile rates?
Yes.
Insurance rates?
I was wondering if you have any plans in the next 4 years
Yeah.
to address
Sure.
the high rate of
Sure.
automobile insurance.
Thank you. So the question has to do with automobile insurance and the high cost in Louisiana, and it is too expensive. But I am mindful that we actually have had several premium cuts in Louisiana, especially over the last 2 years. State Farm has cut premiums 4 times in 2 years for a 10% reduction. We've also had reductions by Farm Bureau and Progressive, and together they make up the lion's share of the market in Louisiana. And so while they're too high, they are moving in the right direction. There are some things that we ought to be able to do. Some of them are regulatory, by the way, John. We just should not allow an insurance company to charge a widow more because she's a widow when she has a superior driving record. But we in fact allow that to happen. We allow them to charge blue collar workers more when they have superior driving records. We allow them to charge poor people more. So if you have a poor credit history but a great driving record, you still end up paying more for your insurance. And we should not allow that. And that comes from a regulatory approach. I will tell you that I think there are some things that we can probably do through the legislature as well. Whether they translate into lower premiums, I'm not sure. As you may recall, this last year there was a bill called the Omnibus Premium Reduction Act. The problem with the bill is there was not a single line in it that required a premium reduction. And the people who were promoting the bill were testifying in other committees that there wasn't anything the legislature could do that would actually guarantee lower premiums. But there are some things that we ought to do regardless. Some things, by the way, that I have supported since my first term in the legislature. Because one of the things in that bill would double the prescriptive period, which I believe would lower the amount of actual litigation because we have the shortest prescriptive period in the country. And it would allow more times for those cases to be resolved before attorneys ever get involved, and then you would not have that transactional cost of having that file leave an adjuster's hands to go to an attorney's hands. And I think there's some other things that could be agreed to. In fact, there was a compromise bill this year that I think right at half of the things in the bill that didn't make it were agreed to in compromise, and the author of the bill said no, he would rather have nothing, which, by the way, I've been in Baton Rouge for 12 years now. It's a good day when you can get half of what you're trying to get in a piece of legislation, which is a really good indicator that they weren't trying to achieve any real results here with respect to that bill. They were looking for a campaign issue. But I do think there are some things that we can do, and we especially have to try to figure out, because we have one legal system, for example, but we have automobile rates going one direction, down, and we have some commercial rates going up. And we have to really figure out why and make sure that we are working to change that, bring in more competition, have more carriers in Louisiana competing with one another. I think that actually drives down premiums. So there's some work to do, and I'm committed to doing it. It's one of the reasons I established the Research Council in the trucking industry, so that they can go out and compare and contrast Louisiana to other states, see what has worked elsewhere in order to bring in more competition and to lower rates. Yes, ma'am.
There's been a lot of talk about the medical marijuana program that's underway. Tell me how that's going and how you feel about that. And also recreational, there's a lot of states that use that as well. How do you feel about that?
So the question was about the medical marijuana program in Louisiana and about recreational marijuana. I'll get to the second part first. I am not in favor of legalizing recreational marijuana in Louisiana. And I don't believe we're anywhere close to having a majority of the people in Louisiana or a majority of people in Baton Rouge in terms of the legislature to do that. I did and do support legalized medicinal marijuana when it is recommended by a physician for certain medical conditions. I just believe that it ought to be available to the patients. And you know, one of the reasons that I came to this conclusion is we had a lot of people who were being told here in Louisiana that the medicines that were available were not helping with their conditions, and especially if it related to young people who have, for example, seizure disorders. And they had exhausted all of the medicines that the doctors had prescribed, and being told, well, you know, it's quite likely that medical marijuana would help, but you can't have it in Louisiana, so you need to consider moving. Well, I don't think we should ever do that to people in Louisiana, so I supported and continue to support medical marijuana here in Louisiana, and it's been available for a relatively short period of time, but it appears to me that the product is available in the 9 pharmacies that have been licensed to dispense it for the medical conditions that were approved by the legislature. And we're going to be getting reports over time as to how that program is working. But the reports that I've received, and they're relatively limited because it's only been in existence for a short period of time, are actually pretty positive about the people who are coming in and actually availing themselves of medical marijuana, and the doctors who are participating in it and so forth. And it appears that the contracts that the LSU Ag Center have is working properly now, and I know that Southern is supposed to be in a position here very soon where their product is going to actually be on the market as well. Lanny?
To the extent that I can discern, your opponent wishes to make some major changes, maybe, in the management of higher education.
Yeah.
Do you feel that there are any significant changes we should make, considering that we have a large number of presidents and chancellors and so forth,
Yeah.
at very high rates of pay?
Well, the question was on higher ed governance, and this is not something that I believe we should change. If you look around the country, there is no best practice for higher ed governance. And you can pick out the best states that in terms of delivering higher education, and you can pick out the worst, and they're all over the lot. And so this is not something that I think we should get into. It's one of the reasons why I don't support a constitutional convention, because I believe that this is one of the issues that would be brought up that would not advance anything that's important in Louisiana. And I would note that with respect to at least the Southern system and the LSU system, there have been consolidations between the system presidents, for example, and the chancellor's offices at the Baton Rouge campuses. So there have been consolidations and efficiencies there. But higher ed governance is not one of those things that I think we ought to consider. And I will also tell you that I'm 100% against closure of any of our universities. That's not a solution to anything either. You only save $1 on a dollar if those kids are not educated somewhere else, and that cannot be our goal. Our goal cannot be to educate fewer people. And then if you want to close one of them, tell me which one it's going to be. And then go find the 2/3 vote in the legislature willing to do that. It's to me, that's not a direction that we ought to be going. I know that that's something that has animated Mr. Grigsby for a long time, and it's one of the reasons why, quite frankly, he is so motivated to continue his role as a puppet master. I don't agree with that. Yes, ma'am.
Could you speak a little bit about your experience when you were a member of the House Education Committee
Yeah.
and when certain education reforms were rolling out, particularly with regards to school voucher programs and the role that your opponent played in
Yeah,
something?
well, it's no secret. Mr. Rispone is an advocate of vouchers. He advocated for the bills that passed in 2012 that I opposed. And if you'll go back, you'll see that I opposed them because I said that the voucher program was not being carefully designed, that there were going to be a lot of problems related to accountability going forward, that we were going to encourage parents to take their kids out of much better public schools and send them to voucher schools that would not be of high quality. And I was somewhat surprised not long ago that Betsy DeVos actually said the exact same thing, that the Louisiana voucher program was very, very poorly designed and poorly implemented, and that's being borne out now with the investigative reports that show that voucher schools are being allowed to participate by simply filing a notice of intent to participate in the program. They don't even get a site visit from the Department of Education. And the application that they submit in order to participate in the voucher program is only about a dozen pages. It's short answers. They don't have to disclose much of anything. On the other hand, a charter school, they're going to submit something that looks like an encyclopedia of information. They're going to get site visits, and there's going to be much more accountability with respect to those schools. But you will also recall that I opposed the voucher program because I said it was unconstitutional. Specifically, it was unconstitutional because it was going to take MFP dollars and give them to non-public schools, even though the MFP is in the state constitution and it talks about public elementary and secondary education systems. And not only was it going to take the state's portion, it was going to take the local portion of the MFP dollars and give those to private schools. And there were people all over the place said, oh no, that's not really happening. But when the system was in fact declared unconstitutional for the very reasons that I said it was unconstitutional by the state Supreme Court, the first thing that had to happen was the Department of Education had to repay more than $20 million to local school districts that had been stolen from them. So I was right to oppose it then. I am right to demand more accountability and transparency today because the program, quite frankly, is not working very well. The worst performing schools we know anything about in Louisiana today are voucher schools. Not to say that all of them are bad, but the worst that we know anything about are voucher schools. And we have schools that are participating in the program with 100% of its student enrollment being there on vouchers. That's not what people thought would happen when this thing passed. Although I was careful to point out that there was nothing in the structure of the voucher system that Mr. Rispone supported and talked Bobby Jindal into pursuing that would prevent that from happening.
Governor,
Yes, Jim?
Is this your last race?
Well, I never say never. This is the last one that I can foresee today, standing in front of you. I just heard my wife clear her throat over there. So I don't have any intentions, I don't have any plans, but I am not here to say never. I will tell you that the only job that I'm looking forward to is a second term as governor, to continue the work that we've been able to do and to keep our state out of the ditch and on the road that it's currently on, which is a much better path for our state. And then after that, I do not have any plans, sweetie. Okay. Is it? Okay, so I'm gonna skip the closing statement because they didn't tell me I would be allowed to give one. Just know that if I were gonna give a closing statement, I would once again ask you, where is Eddie? Thank you.